Americans began to know about Surrealism in the late 1920s, when reports and some photographs of works circulated in art magazines. But in 1931, New York gallery owner Julian Levy bought Dali's Persistence of Memory for $250. Levy had travelled to Paris in 1927 and on the journey met Marcel Duchamp and was introduced into the Surrealist circles. When he returned to the USA, he decided to become a gallery owner and promote Surrealism and later abstract expressionism. In 1932, he mounted the exhibition Surrealism, which introduced the Surrealist art movement to New York. A month earlier, the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Connecticut had presented an exhibition they entitled Newer Superrealism, which included works by de Chirico, Dali, Max Ernst, André Masson, and others. These two exhibitions will have been seen by many artists who were then inspired to work in the Surrealist style. Art historians like to label artists and styles. The work of Peter Blume, James Guy, Louis Guglielmi, and others were later given the label social surrealists, as their work was often infused with social commentary and reflected their left-wing political views. Among the earliest of American surrealist paintings was Peter Blume's South of Scranton of 1931. This was met by derision from most art critics. The reaction to it was one of the most publicised controversies in American art. His Eternal City of 1937 arose from a visit he made to Rome, usually described as Roma Eterna, the Eternal City. Many of the motifs are drawn from what he saw on that visit. He was outraged by the fascist government and thus inserted an incongruous yellow and red jack-in-the-box with a luminous green image of Mussolini's head. His output was quite small. His most popular work is undoubtedly The Rock of 1944 to 48. This shows workmen struggling to construct the modern building on the left and to demolish a ruined ancient house on the right. In the centre lies a strange, massive, jagged rock with a reddish interior core and a smooth greenish surface, its form suggesting an egg shape. This painting clearly has a narrative, and people read into it all sorts of political messages. Tasso's Oak of 1957 to 60 is Blume's surreal reworking of the celebrated Roman landmark Tasso's Oak, under which, according to legend, the Renaissance poet Torquato Tasso used to sit. In contrast to the high culture of Tasso, the oak is seen today surrounded by people undertaking more mundane matters, women knitting, children playing, and lovers meeting. Blume uses the rather neat device of having the dead oak, which is supported by a brick tower and ironwork, sprout from its base a new growth. Here is a photo of the actual oak in Rome. Another early American painter who occasionally worked in the Surrealist style was Louis Guglielmi. Most of his output were paintings somewhat romanticising the working lives of ordinary people. His early painting Persistent Sea is in more surreal style. A door is set into a ruined wall and opens out onto a vast sea with an impossible staircase. This seems somewhat reminiscent of British artist John Armstrong's 1930 painting, The Open Door. Another of his more surreal pieces is his Terror in Brooklyn of 1941, in which three nuns or mourners lost in an empty cityscape, shelter under a glass canopy, such as that used to display small sculptures or delicate objects. Apparently this was intended as a premonition of war and tragedy. James Guy is a more substantial figure in late 1930s and early 40s American Surrealism. His Venus on 6th Avenue of 1937 is amongst his earliest pieces. It is uncompromisingly surreal, depicting a large book, probably titled Love Story, on the left, taller than the woman walking past it. On the right, a sculptor appears to be creating an image of a modern-day Venus, and we see his model looking around a large panel with her head drawn upon it. In the foreground, a young woman, her mouth gagged, seems a bit remote from the events, though from the far distance a man's hand reaches out and tightly holds her head, probably to turn her to face the appearance of Venus, to which he points with his other hand. There is clearly a narrative here, which could be revealed by further study of the sources of this painting. In 1940, he created Moon Star Model, which shows an artist in the process of painting a portrait of a woman model, but he is dissolving into the very frame of the painting. James Guy's work was often infused with social commentary and reflected his left-wing political views. We see this in his painting of Capital minus Labour of 1938. In the mid-1940s, Guy's technique shifted to geometric, non-objective art, as in his untitled Painted Construction of 1944. After working with socialist themes in the early 1930s and producing a number of didactic paintings, Walter Quirt became one of the first American artists to experiment with surrealism. In Conflict of 1935, he manages to combine the surreal with his political message. But in his Poor Man's Religion, also from 1935, he seems more given over to political polemic. In the late 30s and early 1940s, he created a number of surrealist pieces: Obeisance to Poverty of 1938 and The Tranquility of Previous Existence of 1941. In the late 1940s, he turned to creating works primarily showing the influence of Picasso, and his surrealist phase was over. In the 1930s, some American artists, having been exposed to European surrealism, wanted to differentiate themselves from what they saw as an art style somewhat external to America. In 1934, husband and wife team Lorser Feitelson and Helen Lundeberg exhibited their work under the name Post-Surrealism. They wrote a manifesto and gathered a few other artists into the group: Philip Guston, Reuben Kadish, Harold Lehman, Knud Merild, and Grace Clements. Feitelson's work in the 1920s was realist, or perhaps magical realist in style, as with his The Fountain of 1927. In 1930 in Los Angeles, Feitelson was introduced to Walter and Louise Arensberg and became familiar with the collection of modern European art. In 1934, he produced two surrealist pieces, Genesis' first version, within his earlier realist style, but with the enigmatic elements of egg forms and an avocado pear showing its large seed. He then created a second version on the theme of Genesis. Here he has clearly moved into a more explicit surrealism, with various symbols: an opened egg, passion fruit, a pink labia-like shell, a skull-like form of a child with various skin-like facial layers. One of these mask-like layers appears at the bottom right, suckling at a diagrammatically represented outline of a woman's breast. In the background is a tree with no living branches, but with a nest in which a bird feeds its young. On the top right is a reference to the Immaculate Conception. A year or so later, he created Love, Eternal Recurrence, in which we see a couple embracing within a space of wooden benches and other forms. And from the same period comes his Flight over New York at Twilight, in which a couple would appear to be playing a flying game with their child. A wooden bench, similar to that in the previous painting, appears on the front left. In 1940, he painted Post-Surreal Configuration Eternal Recurrence, where a couple are staged within a rocky landscape. At the bottom right, between the feet of the male figure, we see a thin mask-like form, as depicted in the Surrealist Genesis. Feitelson's engagement with Surrealism was short-lived, and by the late 1940s he gave up figurative painting and turned to simple geometric abstract forms. Feitelson's wife, Helen Lundeberg, appears to have gone on much the same artistic journey. Her 1933 painting, The Mountain, is realist or even magical realist. A mere year later, she paints in a surrealist style her plant and animal analogies. 1935 sees her Cosmocide, unusually trapezoidal in shape, the top being narrower than the base. At the top she depicts the moon, and in the air of the middle space a picture plant. On the ground below are some seemingly unrelated objects. Her microcosm and macrocosm of 2 years later is again on a cosmic theme. Here, a cloud of interstellar gas seems to be shown to evolve into the planet Saturn. A large woman with magnifying glass appears to be observing the evolution of primitive cells into more complex living forms. This painting has a clear narrative. The tree of a year later shows an out-of-scale tree growing on a slice of the earth, somewhat like a piece of cake. As with her husband, Lorser Feitelson, she all too quickly abandoned such figurative surrealism and turned to simple geometric forms. At the relatively young age of 21, Reuben Kadish, together with his friend Philip Guston, had the opportunity to paint a large mural at the University of Michoacán in Mexico. From 1934 to 35, they were again commissioned to paint another mural at the City of Hope Tuberculosis Hospital in California. They introduced various surreal elements into this piece. After completing this project, the two split up, with Guston moving to New York and Kadish to San Francisco. In 1935, he painted Lamentation with its theme of the eye. Amusingly, we see a skeleton in a shroud hanging on the wall on the left, compared with a diagram of a sprouting seed on the right. That year, he again used the theme of the eye in his work entitled Dr. Enterzone. An eyeball tethered above the doctor's office is cut through to show the inverted diagrammatic sketch of a beggar. It is pointed at a sculptor's pedestal, on which is a lower torso supported by a crutch. In the doctor's office, beneath the eyeball, we see the white-coated figure of Dr. Entezon himself. His name, of course, means an internal parasite. In 1937, Kadish created a wonderful mural, a dissertation on alchemy, in the chemistry building at San Francisco State College. The little images at the base depict the four elements. From the left, rocks as earth, the bellows as air, the salamander as fire, and the shell as water. Above this, we see an egg, opened up to reveal a blue cube, yellow tetrahedronal form, brown earth-like sphere, and a red spiral. Reuben was not merely using the idea of alchemy symbolically, but it's obvious that he had seen examples of its symbolism and emblematic images. For example, in the leftmost top panel, we see a circle with a square inside, then a triangle, a square, and a man and woman. This image is directly quoted from the early 17th century alchemist Meikle Guy's Atalanta Fugiens. The whole mural is informed by alchemical imagery. Kadish sadly abandoned art during the Second World War and the decade following. Later he returned to creating artwork, but now in the medium of sculptures. Philip Guston only created a few surrealist paintings, such as Nude Philosopher in Space-Time of 1935, before turning to a more individualistic style. Federico Castellon began drawing and painting at an early age after his family moved from Spain to New York City in 1921. Among his earliest surrealist pieces is Measured Man of 1934, with its abstract forms. In his Veronica's Veil of 1937, he chooses a classical subject, but gives it a rather powerful surreal twist. His Dark Figure of a Year Later paints a mysterious hooded woman dominating the foreground. Behind her is the back wall of a house and a tangle of bodies of a man, woman and child, like a distorted nuclear family. The male head is that of Castellon himself. Castellon had enormous skills at drawing, and this informed his paintings. Many of his pencil drawings clearly show the influence of Dali, as in The Embedded Soul with a Victim of a Wolf of 1936, and The Blind Leading the Blind. His late 1930s painting, The Return of the Prodigal, shows his mastery of the medium. He made many etchings and lithographs, including The Alchemist and a series of erotica. Charles Rain attended the Art Institute of Chicago for 2 years before leaving for Europe in 1933. In Europe he studied in Berlin and travelled through Vienna and Paris, visiting art museums and absorbing European painting. This portrait he made in 1934 is likely to be a self-portrait. In the 1940s, he created a series of surrealist works. Perhaps the best known is The Enigmatic Game of 1945, with its bird-headed chess pieces on a chessboard in intergalactic space. In The Green Enchanteur of a Year Later, a knowing face looks out from behind a thin green mask which is peeling away. The eye of this figure engages us with a penetrating gaze. The Magic Hand of 1949 appears in photographs to be a three-dimensional construction, but is actually a trompe-l'oeil painting. What appears to be a mirror is a painting within the painting. The hand in the foreground holds a tarot card, and we see the tarot cards of the Hanged Man and the Sun lying upon the table. Gertrude Abercrombie started painting in the early 1930s. She was based in Chicago and thus not immersed in the sophisticated modern art circles in New York and California. Her work is often dismissed as naive and seen as a regional Midwestern art style, but it clearly has surreal aspects, and she was certainly not an unsophisticated person, being a major part of the bebop jazz world. Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker were both good friends of hers. The main periods of her work were the 1940s and 50s. Here is the Ivory Tower of 1945. Her simple paintings usually evoke a strange mood. As we see in The Bride of 1946, where a bride is shown all alone in an empty plain, where only a dead, blasted tree is seen. She has a long, lonely walk towards the far distant church. Abercrombie often painted trees set on a barren plain, as in her A Terribly Strange Tree of 1949, where the rather occluded sun shines from an unlikely clouded sky with only a small patch of blue showing upon a leafless tree bearing a flag. Somehow an Egyptian-style pyramid has appeared on the plain. The long shadows do not work with the position of the sun, and at the tip of the tree's shadow is a solitary red flower. She liked to depict owls and cats. Here is her Owl and Bone of 1954, which has a similar structure to The Strange Tree. Autoportrait from 1953 shows her with an owl. She often incorporates a subtle humour into her paintings, as in Split Personality and Levitation. Abercrombie became part of a Midwestern art movement, which included her friend Carl Priebe. While he is best known for his paintings of birds, some of his work has surreal elements. Here is one in much the same style as Abercrombie. Cat on Table. And another clearly in a different style. A now almost forgotten Chicago artist, Julia Thekla, incorporated surreal elements in her paintings. She seems to have even experimented with fumage and grattage. This is her Woman of 1936 and Full Moon of 1945. Another much neglected surrealist is Gerrie von Pribosic Gutmann. In 1939, she studied with the post-surrealist painter Lorser Feitelson and met and married the abstract artist Victor von Pribosic. It was not a happy marriage. They divorced not long after, and there was a very bitter custody battle over their child. These personal struggles appeared in her paintings. In 1949, she married the well-known photographer John Gutmann. Her self-portrait of 1946 presents her in a rather unsettling domestic interior, in which a doll with its skull opened holds a pair of scissors over a smaller doll. Beside them, a large scorpion prowls. Torso interior of the same year would appear to be her visualizing of her pregnancy. One of her best-known paintings surely must be The Dinner Party of 1951. Here the hostess appears to be immobilized in a tree, while her guests talk on or fall asleep from boredom. With most of her works, there would seem to be a personal narrative, only just under the surface. The Theft of 1952 appears to be similarly autobiographical and possibly refers to the artist's loss of custody of her son to her ex-husband. In her painting The Bride, she shows the bride in her carriage, which has lost its drawing horse. It appears more like a death cart or hearse than a bridal carriage. A skull lies at her feet, and a morose fox appears to be the driver of her carriage. In the sky above, a horse comes to her rescue, but it is being ridden by a skeleton. Sadly, she committed suicide in 1969, leaving only a small output of Surrealist paintings. Some people may have noticed that we have not yet considered the work of Americans Dorothea Tanning nor of Kay Sage. Sage we'll consider under a lesson on the European exiles in the USA, and Tanning in the lesson focusing on women Surrealists. The next lesson will look at the exile of European Surrealists to the USA during the Second World War.